Hi, everyone. We're just going to give it a second for the Zoom to allow everyone to trickle in. Welcome, welcome. Hello and welcome again. Thank you for joining us for our Live from the Studio with Aiden Kirkegaard, our 2024 ECU Studio Award winner, and Homa Khosravi, our 2024 BIPOC Studio Award winner. My name is Bahar Mahazebnia, and I'm the Assistant Curator of Engagement here at Griffin Art Projects. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that our work takes place on the unceded, ancestral, and unsurrendered territories of the Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish nations, to whom we are deeply grateful. I would also like to thank North Vancouver Recreation and Culture, Emily Carr University of Art, and the Shumka Center through RBC, as well as the Friby Foundation for their generous support of Griffin's residency programs. Lastly, I'd like to mention that there will be a chance for an audience Q&A after both Homa and Aiden have completed their presentations. But if at any point throughout the presentations you have a question for Homa or Aiden, feel free to type it in the Q&A dialog box below, and we'll address all of the questions during the Q&A portion at the end. You can also choose to raise your hand and ask your question live. We won't be able to see you, but we'll be able to hear your voice. And please just note that this event is being recorded, so if you ask your question live, your voice will also be recorded. Without further ado, I will introduce Homa, our first speaker. Homa Khosravi is an interdisciplinary artist based in Vancouver. She received her MFA from Simon Fraser University and her BFA in painting from Tehran University of Art. Her work touches on surrealism, abstraction, and world building with various more than human creatures through a multitude of mediums, including painting, video, and sculpture installation. Khosravi explores the human body and its connection to memory, fantasy, and the uncanny, highlighting a foundation of humor found within. Khosravi investigates human experiences of her body and mind in relation to her environment, vis-a-vis the process of making the artworks, the choice of colors, and the materiality found within the installation. And without further ado, I will pass it on to Homa.
Hi, thanks, Bahar, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. Thanks for taking the time and joining us. Thanks everyone at Griffin, Lisa, and everyone who helped. It's been a wonderful time here. So I am going to share my screen. So I think now you can see my screen, right?
Yes,
okay.
We can.
Okay, perfect. So I like to start by showing some of my older work, my paintings, just to start, and introducing my work a little more. So this is the first body of work that I done in 2018. My first solo show right after I graduated back home in Iran. I've always been interested in plants and nature and organic shapes, and mostly like botanical drawing and illustration. So I started my first collection by focusing more on the inside of human body and plants and their connection and how similar they are. So these are all painting on acrylic on canvas, 1.5 meter, if I'm not wrong. And this is like the start point of me really focusing on like the human body and its connection to nature. And I did a lot of studies on botanical illustration, especially medical books, older ones that have like illustrated images of body and plants. And then to move a bit quicker, I'm gonna jump a few years after, when I moved to Canada in 2021. I started my MFA. So that was a very important time in my life. I've moved here. I was dealing with a lot of big feelings and emotions. I was going under like the grief of the loss of my mother, and also moving into a new country, adjusting and settling in this new space. So all of these big feelings were affecting my work and my paintings and the way I was thinking about my environment. But also one thing that happened a little after I settled in, maybe after 6 months or a year, was this new feeling of missing this visual elements that were not around me anymore. Kind of this like craving for these little images and moments that I used to be surrounded with back home, but then it wasn't the same here. And I just started to realizing how much this is affecting my work and how much I'm craving for those visuals again, and how much I'm going back in my memories and in images and like pictures I had from before to like feel them again. So yeah, so in a simple way, the way of like this homesickness I was feeling and the nostalgia I was craving. So that's where I started to, this is a project I did in first or second semester of my MFA. I was working on wooden boxes. The inside of the boxes were empty, and there were videos and little objects from home that I put in the boxes, and they were installed on the wall. But the outside of the boxes, I painted them with acrylic paint. But I went back to this rose and nightingale theme, this Persian, traditional Persian motif and paintings that they're very important in my culture, and they're like one of the things that I saw everywhere. I was surrounded with it, but then I missed it when I moved here. So I was going back at it and kind of doing my own interpretation of it, and doing adding my own narrative to this traditional element. So during my MFA, I was more focused on 3D works, and that led to making a sculpture for my final work. And just going back to my notes. So yeah, I'm not gonna talk about the sculpture that much. It's a whole another story, but after I graduate, I went back to painting again. So this is where the creature and the eyes made their way back to my work, and I start using more colors, more vibrant colors, and more focusing on the delicate kind of time-consuming technique that I work to make flowers and just paint and do my craft. And yeah, so I think when I moved here, the environment and the nature of Vancouver really affected my work. I became way closer to nature as I used to be, as like Vancouver is beautiful and we're very close with nature here, and water and trees and plants. So that definitely had a huge impact on my paintings. And I became very interested in the nighttime landscapes. I used to take a lot of long walks coming back from the studio to home. And because like here the winter is so long, so we have a lot of nighttime. So I start noticing the lights and the shadows and the little moments that happens at night in like between flowers and bushes and all those things. And I've always been interested in elements of mystery and playing hide and seek with the audience, with the viewers of my work, and just playing with the what is real and what is imagination and all this kind of things. And the choice of flowers are not just purely based on visuals. Especially with daffodils that you see in my work a lot, I really have like a special personal connection to each of these flowers I choose for my work. And especially with daffodils, they remind me of home, and they're a very big remembrance to my mother. And I just also think that the way they look like they're looking at you. The center looks like a mouth, and it's a very like human kind of flower for me. So I really like to paint this flower, as you can tell. Yeah, so I have some pictures from the walks I take and the things that inspired me the most for my composition and the choice of colors and all these things. Most of my inspirations comes from the walks I take at night. Just so you have an idea. So now I'm gonna go and talk about the time I had in the residency here. Well, it's always a little challenging at first when you move to a new space until you settle down and figure out where everything goes and how you want to paint and how you want to work. It's a wonderful place. It's big. It has natural lighting, which I really, really appreciate here. But also one thing that really affecting me here was the trees outside the kitchen. Um, I've been looking at them a lot, and I think just in general, the environment of North Vancouver is very different from the space I had before, and just the environment is really inspiring for me, especially because there are a lot of Iranians in this neighborhood, and every time I walk by a lot of Iranian restaurants, and people are speaking Farsi, and it's just such a different experience being in this neighborhood. So for the work I started to make here, I decided to focus more on the Persian motifs and patterns, and again going back to the rose and nightingale, as we call Golo Bulbul. And this time I wanted to not really shy away from it and actually dive deeper into this and really focus on how this is affecting my work, and how I just during this time I realized I think a lot about my country and where I'm from and the little moments that I had back home while I'm painting. more than I thought I was. So I decided to really focus on that and kind of create my own world of this elements, this traditional craft that is in my culture, and I've been raised with it. So I wanted to kind of create this body of work, kind of like a Persian garden, and make it like kind of like put my own lived experience into it. And yeah, so usually in the bird and nightingale theme, there's a bird, which is very important in the paintings, usually symbolizes the love and longing. And then there is the roses and other flowers. It's always other flowers too. It's just that they just call it rose. It's a very detailed, you can see how much care and attention to details have been to the craft. And this is something I wanted to keep in my work as well. And it's a very romantic and poetic illustration. And these are all the things that I also wanted to embrace in my work and not remove them, actually, like give them more agency. So I've been, these are some pictures and the work. I'm gonna, this is a picture of the actual rose and nightingale that I was talking about. So yeah, this is one of the works I did here. I just finished it a few days ago. So this is a very good example of the rose and nightingale that I was talking about, and how I turned it into my, like, made it kind of more personal for myself. I'm using like the same elements, but I'm trying to kind of give the bird more agency and more character and more soul, kind of. I've been like reflecting a lot about immigration and displacement and being far from home, and also all the when looking at the like current situation and political situation in Iran, I feel like it's affecting my work, especially in the last year with everything that has been going on. So I wanted to, I mean, usually when I finish a work, I actually sit down with it and let the work tell me that what was going in my head and why I painted the way I painted. And then I come up with the reasons. So I feel like, yeah, in this 1 month or 2 months that I've been here, I'm trying to put together these like fragmented images that are both from my lived experience in Iran, and then being here, also being exposed to a lot of Western art history, and just like this kind of complex state of being between things and not really knowing where you should land. And also like just thinking about my country and how the way I feel about it is it's a beautiful place, that a very dark shield is like taking over it, and it's very sad. It's just the way it is. And then I feel like the darkness and the colors I'm choosing are a commentary on the situation of Iran in general and how I feel about it. And maybe the creatures, maybe the birds that I'm painting are kind of like self-portraits or are just like an example of like the people, the uncertainty and the sense of fear maybe. And also I decided to add this element of thorns around my canvases, like kind of the frame. I wanted to expand the painting, and not just focusing on what's going on the canvas, but also trying to break that attention for the audience and make them look around it as well, but also giving it a sense of like danger, or like it's like not a really maybe safe place to enter, but at the same time having this like calm, welcoming look of my creatures and the plants. I feel like it's very peaceful, but at the same time it's a little unsettling. Yes. So there are pictures. Yeah, I think I'm done talking about my voice. And yeah, there is no more pictures.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Homa. Got a question. I've got a few questions for you, but we'll save them for the Q&A at the end.
Sure.
Thanks so much for sharing your work with us.
Yeah.
Great. Hi, Aiden.
Hello.
Thank you again, Homa. I'll introduce Aiden and then pass it on to you to begin presenting. Aiden Kirkegaard is a painter working in Vancouver and a recent 2024 MFA grad from Emily Carr University of Art and Design. Aiden received her BFA with a minor in art history from the University of British Columbia, Okanagan in 2020. As a painter, Aiden's work explores how the physical and material process of painting can elicit memory and dreaming. Painting for Aiden becomes a mode in which she accesses personal memory and images and alternative realities. Her physical studio space becomes a bewildering place for dreaming. The actions of mixing acrylic paint, engaging with color, and building shaped canvases and putting brush to canvas all encompass a process-based approach to making. And without further ado, Aiden, I'll pass it on to you to begin presenting.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm like, oh, that's perfect. Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here today and yeah, get to share my work with you. Yeah, as mentioned, my name's Aiden. And before I kind of dive into what I want to talk to you about, I thought I'd just kind of give you a bit of a layout of what I'm going to share and kind of how I wanted to kind of walk through things here. So firstly, I'll kind of start by briefly chatting about some of my previous work and kind of how a lot of my ideas around painting have come to be. From there, I'll kind of speak about my MFA work. As was mentioned, I recently graduated from Emily Carr just this past May. So a lot of what I was doing there is still very fresh in my mind. It's only been about a month and a bit since graduating. And then, of course, I'll kind of close with what I've been up to during my time here doing this residency. So to get started, I wanted to show you this piece, which is titled, I Always Have to Load the Dishwasher. No, you don't. And this piece was one that I made back in 2019. And right around this time was when I really started exploring ideas around memory and really specifically thinking about the kind of spaces and architecture that hold a lot of memory. And so this is really where my interest in kind of domestic space and my childhood home as kind of a point of reference for my work started. And in a lot of the beginning works, the gestural brushstrokes in my paintings kind of often aimed to represent like memories or movements of family life. conversations, feelings, all those kinds of things that are all kind of encompassed in the home. So I was kind of asking at this time questions like, how do I materialize emotion in painting? How can these marks I am making represent memory and emotions? And so here is another work. And here the simple architectural imagery kind of refers to the house that I grew up in. Often I use very kind of simple planes of color, really breaking down the space. And so there's just kind of this reference to like nooks and corners of the places that I grew up in. And in a lot of my older works as well, and you'll kind of see a few of the titles here. But yeah, titles were also really important for me in kind of exploring how I was sharing these memories, and kind of being playful with them. And yeah, and it also gave me an opportunity to think about poetics and how that kind of ties into my painting practice. And that's something I think I'm still trying to figure out, as well, is the role of kind of titles and poetics and things. Here is another work titled Great Popsicles Are My Least Favorite Popsicle. And this is a work I made at kind of the very end of my undergrad in 2020. And again, I bring up these paintings because I often actually come back to them often. It's kind of was a time where I was really, exploring gesture and making marks and starting to work larger. A lot of these are kind of 4 by 5 feet, and really exploring kind of like my relationship to acrylic paint. Specifically in this one, I was thinking a lot about memories of being outside in the summer. And so memories not only of like inside space in terms of domestic space, but also outside space. And what that looked like, kind of the inside and outside. I really wanted to create marks that felt sticky and messy through kind of like the different acrylic mediums that I was using, often using a lot of like gloss medium mixed into stuff. And this is again kind of, my work kind of has just continued to develop from here, where I'm thinking about like the kind of marks that I can make and what I can mix into them to make them really goopy and sticky and messy and all of that. So to kind of jump into some more of my master's work, over the past 2 years in my MFA, I had been really working on researching a specific question around my painting practice, which is how can paintings become vessels for holding memories tied to home? And so to kind of explore this research question, the work I was making took a process-based approach to research. And so I was really just focused on doing a lot of my research through the act of painting. So the physical side of my research, the actual like what I was doing in the studio included, mixing acrylic paint, building the shaped stretcher frames, and then of course applying paint to my canvases. And I think a lot about in this time as well, like I think about memory in my practice and how memories, even those we may not remember or those that are like possibly just like left unremembered, all of those things kind of line the walls of the spaces that we grew up in, and they're really kind of embedded and woven into the architecture of those spaces. And I'm really fascinated with that and thinking about these things, these memories, as having like a very lively quality to them. So through the material exploration of painting, a lot of my recent work has been kind of rooted in 2 specific childhood homes. And these homes were places for me that really elicited dreaming and wonder in me as a child. I can remember countless times, being sent outside to play with my siblings in the backyard, and we'd come up with all kinds of imaginary worlds to live in, and playing pretend and using our imagination was definitely a huge part of my experience of growing up. And so maybe that's why I have this kind of association or fondness towards these spaces. where, yeah, now as an artist, I feel like I get to kind of re-enter into that state of mind, that state of being where I get to kind of play pretend in my studio with paint. And through these kind of large scale paintings, I get to create these new imaginary worlds that are kind of rooted in these memories that I have. And yeah, as I've kind of been making these works, these paintings really have become less about representation of like specific real space and more about kind of referencing something that maybe feels familiar or is understandable, like a doorway or some form of architecture, but ultimately painting fictional space. And I did want to highlight, like, as I speak about my recent work and what I'm kind of doing right now, yeah, that there's kind of like three key areas of interest for me in kind of thinking about this work, and I'll kind of dive into each of them. So first is kind of this concept I've touched on a little bit of like dreaming and memory. Second is kind of my relationship to paint materials. And then lastly, thinking through kind of painted marks and gesture and kind of what role they play in a painting. So in this painting, the sounds never escape me. The doorway, ceiling corner, and window really become a place for kind of daydreaming and reflection of the spaces I go to in my mind. And in my work, the imagery of kind of doorways and windows has really been important, as they're kind of this part of architecture, domestic architecture, and just in general, that obviously like allow for movement through different spaces, and they kind of become like this passageway. And so I'm interested in kind of these passageway moments in architecture. When we allow ourselves to enter into a state of daydreaming, our mind often wanders to places we remember. And this being said, of course, not all of our daydreams come from a place of truth. And so often my memories that I have, and through that kind of process of remembering, it also gets mixed with my imagination. And some of the things I'm remembering aren't necessarily true or exact or fact, but they're, truth, fact and fiction, truth and imagination, like all of that kind of gets blended together in these works. So as I think about dreaming and memory, I've come to find the term reverie. And I define the word reverie as really being this state of musing or daydreaming. And in the painting process, the act of daydreaming becomes a way for me to really reimagine and process the layers of memories that are held within the spaces that I grew up in. And of course, like within homes is a very like, there's a complexity of experiences. And it's really important to me that the painted mark I'm using is not only like pretty ribbons or really dainty or flowy or angelic in some way, although some might be painted as such. But that also my painted marks include things that may seem gross or globby or loud or harsh, rough, all of that, as all of those kinds of things are included in the spaces that we might have grown up in as kind of complex charged spaces. So through my painting process, I really get to re-explore and reimagine the way I really move around my childhood home. And because of this, I feel like painting has really opened up this kind of new world of dreaming and kind of wonder to me, and playing through materials. And someone who really kind of inspired me in thinking about this and thinking about my paintings is actually a sociologist named Tanya Davidson, and specifically her writing titled "The Role of Domestic Architecture in the Structuring of Memory." And in that kind of text, she considers how our childhood homes become kind of like second bodies for storing memory in the same way that our own bodies accumulate and hold memory. And so here I actually have a quote from her text that's kind of always resonated with me in kind of my ideas around all this stuff. So it says, "The house as a home is not only possible through these repetitive acts and movements through time, These everyday movements that act to create a home leave traces like stains and pencil etchings of children's heights on a wall and worn paths in carpets. Etched in the house are the scars on the house as body, marking and insisting remembrance. The residues of these gestures make the house a structure that marks and remembers in specific ways. And so to kind of like bring these thoughts back into the context of my studio, because she does not write about painting at all, I really see what she's saying kind of tying to my painting process and how each paint stroke and pencil mark and stitch kind of become this trace of movement and senses. And they, my movements kind of become evident and documented through the kind of marks that are left on the canvas. And so I really like to think about how these painted marks allow the paintings I'm making to become a type of vessel or like body of its own that remembers, the same way that, as Davidson kind of speaks about, like a house remembers kind of the movements and moments of its inhabitants. And again, I mean, I've kind of touched on this, but I just also want to highlight that like homes are very charged places with very complex memories, and domestic architecture can hold all kinds of things, including abuse and trauma, and that history also can get etched into its structure. But this being said, in terms of my work, I'm really focused on not on that aspect of memory, but on kind of creating these imaginative spaces that are not so much focused on kind of like very specific memories that I have, but are more kind of branching beyond into like something that maybe didn't exist before, a whole new imaginary world, if that makes sense. So in my work, the physical structure of the stretcher frame and kind of creating shaped canvases has also become very important. And so I see these kind of shaped canvases as further kind of referencing architecture in the work. And as my work has gotten larger, the scale of them also has kind of reinforced the experience of architecture that we sometimes can have kind of in terms of our body and experiencing architecture. So here in this picture, like just having a painting tower over you and that experience, or almost like there's this kind of little, in this painting, like almost like this mini doorway that you could imagine kind of walking through. And so thinking about that relationship. Here the shaped canvas becomes kind of this extension of the architectural imagery that is painted on the canvas. And here this painting itself is actually stacked. So it's two paintings kind of combined to create one. And so I also get very excited about the way that, because I'm kind of connecting to the space, kind of gets fragmented. And so does kind of your understanding of space when you're standing up close to it. It almost feels like a bit topsy-turvy, or the perspective isn't quite right. And so there's something kind of unreal about it, and doesn't quite make sense how this space kind of exists. So for me, I've always really appreciated the way that acrylic mediums and acrylic paint as a medium, provides me just a way to work really quickly and to layer up and that kind of thing. And it's also such a versatile medium, which is why I get quite excited about it. It can be watered down to kind of use it as like a type of stain, or almost like a watercolor. When you paint it on raw canvas, I really enjoy that kind of staining effect that happens. And you can also add a lot of different mediums to it to make it thick, fluid, goopy, like glossy, matte, all that kind of thing. There's quite a lot that you can do with it. I find it so exciting when you have kind of like a glossy and matte surface interacting with each other. And because of this kind of interaction of surface, depth is kind of achieved through the mark and the color, often based on the way that the light is hitting the piece or and that kind of thing. And it's these kind of sometimes subtle but kind of playful shifts in maybe the paint's finish or texture, maybe viscosity, color, like all of those kinds of things that really fascinate me and have kind of made me excited about diving into like my relationship with acrylic paint and what it kind of offers me. I learn a lot from simply playing with my paint materials. And I find that this kind of play in the studio really allows me to gain knowledge and kind of create like a type of painterly language through a very playful exploration that I have happening when I'm making my marks. So another piece of writing that's really impacted me is actually a text by Rachel Jones titled "On the Value of Not Knowing, Wonder Beginning Again and Letting Be," where she speaks about kind of the intelligence of materials. And to summarize, Jones really speaks about how matter, but matter kind of referring to the materials we use in making, participate in the act of making, and that there's actually a lot of knowledge that can be learned and kind of gained from our materials. And I see this kind of happening all the time as I'm working in the studio. You know, my canvas and paint speak to me. The canvas will, tell me when it's being pulled too hard based on how it ripples. As it's being kind of stretched over a canvas frame, it'll tell me when it can't hold any more paint, as it starts to, allow the excess to seep through the back side of the canvas and onto the floor. And it's been really exciting as I've worked with raw canvas in a lot of my pieces. And so I've gotten to kind of like understand the, this different relationship of this material, this canvas, and what it does, and what it does compared to a gessoed kind of prepared surface. Allowing my canvas to stay in raw form has kind of meant that my mark making kind of becomes harder to control at times and predict, which is quite exciting. And I've noticed kind of I'm having to learn like my colors dry different or they layer differently, and my paint just drips and pours differently. And so I have to kind of learn how to either like gain some control or kind of let it go depending on what I'm doing. But when I think about kind of my materials, I really like see that feels like there's this dance kind of happening between the two of us, the paint and myself, the canvas and myself, kind of working together to kind of create these works. And so, as I'm working, I'm often kind of continuously adjusting kind of the relationships that colors have with one another in the painting process. And I really see the process of working with color as a relational one, and one that I'm also learning about, which is kind of why I'm jumping to color next here. And so artist and educator Joseph Albers speaks of this, insisting that in visual perception, a color is almost never seen as it really is, as it physically is. This fact makes color the most relative medium in art. And so in this sense, color is like constantly changing and being perceived differently and dependent on the viewer or the environment or even just the time. Colors present themselves in kind of like a continuous state of flux and are constantly changing, related to kind of like what other colors they might be next to or changing conditions, that kind of a thing. And I just find this exciting in my work, thinking about color as another material that I'm learning from, and another language that I'm trying to kind of, figure out. And I think there's so much potential in color and the way that it can communicate meaning. A lot of my inspiration for these paintings comes kind of from taking in the colors of my surroundings often. Color also can kind of go beyond just describing visual things. I'm not always interested in like, oh, my childhood room was this color, so that's the color I'm using in my painting. I'm very much kind of I don't want to say making that up as I go, but kind of responding in the moment and not always basing things in like what they were in real life. But yeah, color can also kind of describe like sounds and emotions, smell, feel, movement, all of those kinds of things. Kandinsky writes that colors have been described even as like rough or sticky. Others is kind of like smooth, uniform, where someone almost like a color might affect you where you want to like stroke it or touch it. And some colors feel more rough, some feel soft, that kind of thing. And so kind of as Kandinsky describes here, color has this real sense of animacy and a lively energy that I think is just like a really powerful tool for painters. And I get very excited about color and what it can do in terms of helping to describe this kind of multi-sensory experience. So my paintbrush in hand, I really see as like things that two beings that work together to not only depict light, color, and form, but it's also through kind of their actions that, the essence of like a well-loved and lived-in home kind of comes to life, that these imaginations and memories that I have are brought forward. And so I get excited by the fact that like a painted drip becomes a trace or kind of leftover of possibly like a body running down the stairs and kind of reflecting that movement. But it also like acts as kind of a remembrance of like the tilting of the canvas that was done by my body to kind of make the paint drip along the canvas surface. And so these marks kind of can speak to both the memories of home, but also kind of the memory of the painting process. And making painted marks is really an important part of my process. And it's not only rooted in the work of contemporary painters, but also in movements of abstract expressionism in kind of the 1950s. And so I find myself really drawn to the relationships of people like Helen Frankenthaler and Joan Mitchell. Here are two kind of just pictures that I took at the Chicago Art Institute last summer. For them, paint was kind of this instrument that was used to describe movement, emotions, and the materiality of paint kind of really directed and directly informed how a painting was developed. And so with this movement of art kind of comes an aim of pulling away from a form of specific representation. And, they were really aiming to kind of have the works become expressions of self, kind of rooted in emotions and chaos. And I think this is where like gesture really comes into play, gesture becoming a really important kind of element in this kind of work. And so for me as well, gesture is really important in the kind of marks that I'm making. And and thinking about the way that gesture can kind of reflect multiple things. So just to kind of close, some of these next couple slides are just some images of what I have been working on right now during my time in this residency. I paint most of my things on the floor and on the ground because I do so much pouring, or I just am using a lot of paint and I want to control a drip in a certain way, etc. And the studio space has just been so wonderful in terms of its size and the way it's really allowed me to kind of spread out and let the paintings dry on the floor. And I feel like because of this and because of this space, I've seen the way it's kind of impacting this new work that I'm making. I feel like I'm making a lot more kind of watery, washy marks compared to before. And I think I'm really drawn to these kind of marks because of their kind of lack of predictability. Often when I come back to the studio, the day after I've been painting, I'm usually met with a surprise as I see the way the paint pigment dried or kind of bled on the canvas, where certain colors have become more prominent than others. Maybe it actually like, because of the weight of the canvas or other paint on it, like it dripped in a whole new direction than I was expecting. And so I love those little surprise moments that happen that I couldn't have controlled or predicted. And kind of within this kind of thinking about my mark making further, I've been thinking a lot about a concept called plasticity. And the word and concept of plasticity can really be defined as the quality of something being easily shaped or molded. And so I see this concept relating to the way that I'm thinking right now a lot about paint and memory, as they're both kind of these subjects that are being transformed and changed over time, and they're never staying the same. Yeah, one goal I had coming into this residency was to really push myself to kind of loosen up and push the kind of marks that I'm making with the paint. Not just making marks that kind of are I would standardly make with a certain paintbrush or a certain size, but kind of pushing myself to make marks in a different way. In some of my previous work, I feel like I've been a lot more planned in the kind of marks that I wanted to make. Often I'll sketch the works out completely on my iPad first, you know, and even like taking pictures along the way through the process of making. And although I haven't completely disregarded this kind of sketching tool, it's been nice to kind of take a moment to like respond to the paintings in front of me and kind of act more, I guess, impulsively at times, and then have to learn how to edit and cover things up and that kind of way. And so in these works specifically, a lot of the only kind of planning that came into it was deciding a bit of composition around like maybe a doorway or architecture. But other than that, a lot of it's been kind of responding in the moment to the marks that are being made, which has kind of been a fun, like new kind of way to be working, I guess. And so while I've been here, yeah, I've been also working a lot more modularly. As I continue on in my practice, I've just been thinking practically about my work. And a lot of my work is really large. And sometimes I'm connecting pieces together, but there's still like 2 6-foot by 7 feet canvases kind of connected. And so it's been fun to think about connecting some smaller pieces together to make a larger work. But then also with that, I've had to kind of navigate like the seams of the canvases touching and yeah, like navigating that interaction of like color and do I highlight the seam, do I not, where they're connected, and all of that. Yeah, I think it's some of that kind of technical stuff that's been fun to kind of dive into and explore more. And I also like this idea and thinking about that and connecting these canvases, working modularly. I like the idea where like this work is able to be kind of transformed multiple times over. And so that being said, kind of like where the canvases can be connected together, maybe even later on in the process, and then taken apart or placed with other pieces later on. And so they're very like, I feel like, yeah, every couple days my paintings are kind of switched around in different orientations, and what mark, you know, like what space used to look like this is then flipped upside down. And so I'm having a lot of fun just playing with things and kind of flipping things around, and reconnecting things. And I feel like this really relates to the way that I'm, you know, thinking about constructing these kind of dream spaces within the work. And in my practice, I'm kind of like piecing space together, constructing space out of these canvases and kind of imagining something new within my memories. But yeah, I think I will end things there. Thank you so much for listening to me as I spoke about my practice, and I'll pass it back to you, Bahar.
Wonderful. Thank you, Aiden. We'll give Homa a minute to join us again. There she is. Hi.
Hi.
Thank you to you both Those were just intriguing presentations. I've come up to the studio and I've seen your work and I've seen it in passing, but it's just been lovely to hear you both walk us through your process. I was excited when we had two painters coming into the studio, and I knew your work would be very different, but now I'm realizing that there's quite a bit of overlap between your methodological approaches to painting. Um, we'll dive into the first question in the Q&A, if that's okay with the both of you. Awesome. So Diana Han is asking a question. She says, "Hi, this is Diana. Thank you so much for offering the inspiring talk. I'm curious about how the artists understand the context of the Griffin residency and being together in the same space. What is the potential and what are the opportunities? And do they think 2 months is a good amount of time to spend together in the space? I'm wondering how Homa and Aiden see similarities or differences in their approaches to the medium and materiality of painting during the residency." Who wants to go first? Homa, we'll start with you.
Okay. Well, hi. Thank you for the question. That's a very interesting question. So there was like few question in one question. So I'm gonna answer what I remember. I think the space and the fact that we're both here and we both are here like a lot together, and it's like we've been sharing a lot of like talks and just like concerns and all of these things, which is really nice. I've been enjoying it a lot. The talks we have in the kitchen or like having tea or something, it's been really nice. I feel like, yeah, it has made me realize because it's interesting when you look at your work in your own space and there's no other paintings or painter around, and then when you're in a space with another painter. So I think one thing I've noticed is that when I was in my own space, or I wasn't really like next to another, I mean, I was sharing my studio with another painter, but it was like very different still from this. I think I realized it changed my mind about like maybe the use of a color I do in my own work, maybe, or like realizing that before I thought my work is very colorful, but now I'm like not thinking like that anymore, which is very interesting. Yeah. And I think 2 months is a good time, but of course it's nicer if it's more than 2 months. But yeah, I had enough time to make almost three new works and work on my other projects that I brought with me here and like finish them and go back to them and change things. So it's been a good time, but yeah, it all depends on your practice and how you work. So yeah.
I can jump in here too. I was actually thinking about color as well. Like it's funny that I was looking at my paintings the other day, and I mean they're still very colorful, but they have I've been leaning towards like some darker colors or even like more muted tones. Um which is kind of interesting. I don't think I was like consciously thinking about the connection of maybe our work. But it is interesting kind of how that might have impact on I don't know, like the other day I was like, why am I using this like really deep dark like green and purple, like I just don't normally use this. So maybe it's all you. um and yeah, I mean, I think we've said too, like I feel like this residency has just flown by. We're there all the time, and and yet I think, yeah, I think when you're kind of diving in, like time in the studio is just so different than time anywhere else. I feel like maybe that sounds silly, but it just like hours can go by and you don't realize, or there's moments where you're like, did I really just spend 3 hours doing this like tiny little mark? Or like it's you kind of lose track, and you um yeah, your sense of time and productivity is just different. I yeah, I've also started quite a few new ones and finished up some old ones, and I don't know if I have more to add to that, but yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you both. I'll dive in with my first question, and if you in the audience have a question, feel free to type it in the chat, and you can also use the raise hand function to speak out loud. I've been thinking about this sort of dreamlike quality that is evoked in both of your practices through very different lenses. Homa, you have this element of surrealism in your work, and you have these figurative elements that are making these otherworldly narratives. And Aiden, with your paintings, we sort of delve into your dream world, we delve into this subconscious, and we're blending these two different worlds. I'm wondering, what are the most significant challenges you both face in translating such complex and such, what's the word I'm looking for? Ethereal. Like they're very ethereal, they're very transformative. What are the challenges you face in taking these such high concepts into a painting? And Aiden, maybe you can answer first this time since
Yeah,
Homa
yeah.
answered.
um that's a good question. I feel like I have had to learn to, like, a lot of the way that I'm thinking about painting is related to my process. And of course, there's always yeah, you can't always expect that someone coming in is going to like relate to all of those aspects of it. And I think that's why I've kind of started to be like, I think in some of my like early work that I showed, I was being a bit more like direct with some of my titles, being a bit more like revealing of the memories, and kind of trying to paint the spaces even more defined. And and now I feel like I'm kind of trying to loosen that up a little bit to lean into more like color and scale and kind of installation and these things to kind of have, so that someone could have hopefully like an experience with the paintings that maybe causes curiosity or wonder, and just like the way a mark is made or the way it's traveling from one area to the other and that kind of thing. um I yeah, I think, I don't know, like I've read so much like philosophy kind of about this stuff and thinking about phenomenology and like all of these things, and I think that's something that like I'm still kind of trying to figure out, like when thinking about experience and how yeah, how to translate an experience through, especially for me, something quite abstract. um yeah, I don't know if Homa has any thoughts I can.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think, well, I always say that I like my viewer to just take whatever they see from my painting. I also have a very focus on narrative, and I think I do tell stories with my paintings, even maybe I don't wanna, but it just happens the way it is. When you put like my work next to each other, it feels like there is a story going on, which there is in my head, but it might not make sense for some viewer or something. But yeah, I think, well, yeah, I like to give a space to the viewer to take what they feel, but also I'm putting little hints here and there, or using symbolism or things like that to um, make it easier for the viewer to maybe understand what I'm trying to say, or what I'm referencing to, or what are the roots in my work and things like that. Yeah.
Could I say one more thing? I was just thinking about and maybe it's easier. I'm like, it's always easier sometimes to like talk about someone else's, but like with your work, Homa, I think it also is like I get, yeah, I might not understand everything or have all the knowledge to like um know what every little kind of like flower might mean to you, or things, but I have this understanding that like I think that there's, yeah, that there's this story there, that there's and things are very subtle, and like I think we both are maybe trying to play with like subtlety in creating like maybe curiosity in the viewer, or like for you like trying to hide little things for people to discover, I think is kind of cool. Anyways, sorry, that just popped into my head while you're speaking.
Yeah,
So
thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that.
It's so interesting. Homa, your work has this element of whimsy and uncanny with the creature, and Aiden, yours has this like licked surface effect. It's so drastically different, but it's, again, from listening to you both, you're both approaching painting from sort of a similar understanding and appreciation for painting, which leads me into the next question we have here from Lisa. She says, "Hi, Homa and Aiden. It's been fascinating to hear how you both address a form of memory and nostalgia from home. Can you speak about what painting can do that other forms cannot to assist you in this process?" Homa, do you want to go first this time?
Sure. That's a very good question. I think in terms of, if I'm understanding, you mean other forms of art making? Okay. Yeah, I think well, for me, I've also tried more 3D work, and I always went back to painting. I don't know if it's just more familiar to me because I I was raised in a family of painters, and it's just, it feels like home to me, to be honest. And maybe that's just like why I keep going back to it. But also I think I have more knowledge and also more skill and more control over my canvas than I would have over sculpture and other forms that I've tried. But yeah, like I think in painting, for me, with the way I use the brush strokes and colors and the way I paint, for example, I do spend a lot of time on little details in my paintings, and I might sit for like 40 minutes to just paint a little like leaf on a flower. And that is like, feels like home, like the process of what I'm doing is what it makes it like feel like home for me, and it makes me relieve that nostalgia. Maybe it's not even like a memory that is very clear in my head, but I feel it in my body. So the way my body is painting and holding the brush is what like reminds me of home, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I was gonna kind of say something similar actually, where I think um, I think my process of painting is very like um, almost like meditative or very um, like Homa was saying, like there's a lot of time spent with these paintings and it's a very like laborious process. Um, but as like I personally, I actually have like always kind of been a painter. I feel like I haven't dabbled too much with other mediums and um, we were talking about this, like both our dads are painters. And so maybe there is this like thing of even just it's been a medium in our family. Like my Oma, my grandma also is painters. So like you're seeing it as a medium in your family. And so maybe there's this connection there. But also, yeah, like when you kind of build this connection when you spend a lot of time with something. And so I think painting as a medium is like very late, can be very laborious, and you spend a lot of hours on making things and editing them and repainting. And um, but also it becomes kind of like second nature. And so sometimes you also don't have to think about it too much. Your body just does it. Um, and there's that kind of familiarity in the practice of painting, I think, that is comforting and kind of, um, um, yeah. So, yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you both. We'll wrap up with one final question for the both of you. So as your residency at Griffin is coming to a close, what are the next steps you see in your artistic journey? And if you wish, could you share any upcoming projects or the themes or new directions that you're excited to explore with your work?
I can, oh no, you go.
No, no, go.
um, I, okay, yeah, I'm um, two parts of that. I think in terms of um, kind of some of the things I shared, like I'm thinking in terms of my practice, like the practical side of making a little bit. It has been very fun to kind of work modularly. I've kind of been connecting and making shapes more out of rectangles, which um, more traditional kind of sized paintings. And but I am excited to kind of I've been itching to like go make a few more just shaped canvases again, like solely, not connected ones. So I think that's going to be another kind of thing this summer. And yeah, again, kind of diving more into plasticity and that concept in terms of like, um, I have a bunch of articles saved, and I think I just need to spend time with them because the concept is talked about a lot in like more the science realm of thinking about how memory works in your brain. Um, and that's a bit of a new area for me as a painter, but I find it really fascinating thinking about memory. Um, and so, yeah, I want to kind of dive into that a bit more. Um, and I do actually, um, it'll be kind of opening July 10, but have a solo show at a gallery called Dal Schindel Gallery. And so, yes, I'll have kind of some work up there. So that'll be kind of fun to jump into that next.
Yeah, I think for me also, I'm definitely gonna continue working on also shaped canvas. That I had my first, I can show, I can think I did really show this one here. I really liked the experience of working on this canvas and this frame. So I think I'm gonna maybe keep working with these kind of shapes and also just working more on the frames for my canvases and maybe trying new materials to like build the spikes and like the little things I want to put around my canvas. So that's something I'm definitely gonna extend and focus more on. And yeah, I think definitely things have started and gonna continue after the residency. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you, Homa and Aiden, for your captivating presentations and sharing your artistic journey with us today. Um, I'm just incredibly grateful to you both and your presence and your contributions as amazing artists in residence over the past 2 months. You've both been on fire working away in the studio. Um, and thank you to the audience for joining us today. I'd like to invite you to come see Homa and Aiden's works in person at their studios, at our open studios next Sunday, June 23rd, from 12 to 5 p.m. at the Griffin Studios here, where Homa is, at 1180 Welch Street, in North Vancouver. And as well, our current exhibition at Griffin, Prop House, a collection of 1 million objects, curated by Lisa Baldessera and Paul Wong, is up until August 18th, and Griffin is open 12 p.m. to 5 p.m., Fridays through Sundays. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and I wish you a lovely rest of your Saturday afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.